Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill, and I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at the AAVMC. So on this episode of the show, I am exploring the myth of the model minority. Now, my guest is going to help us really dig into this, but suffice to say that there's a general kind of culture out there that some populations where we just have high expectations of academic and professional performance. We expect specifically Asian students and professionals to be great at STEM programs, for example. So when these folks fail to meet our unreasonable expectations, we gasp and clutch our pearls, wondering where they went wrong, or questioning really what we should be doing is questioning our stereotypes and the biases that inform them. So today, to explain the myth of the model minority and its harmful effects, I am joined by Kara Takasaki, a graduate student researcher at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on shades of this topic and some other things that we're going to talk about today. And I am delighted to welcome her to the show to give us the sociological breakdown of this topic. Welcome, Kara. How are you?
Doing good. Thank you for that introduction, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
All right. Thank you for joining us. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive in?
So as you mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at UT Austin in sociology. I'm also a fourth generation Japanese American. I grew up in Hawaii. I'm also a type 1 diabetic, and I study gender and race inequality in paid and unpaid labor. And I've recently been doing a lot of work on COVID-19 in terms of anti-Asian racism with the Stop Hate Reporting Center and on a specific COVID-19 project. My dissertation looks at the work and family lives of Asian American men in Austin in professional occupations. And I've also done some research with STEM graduates looking at race and gender inequality and the transitions into the workforce.
Fantastic. So I can't wait to hear more about, we're going to have to schedule some time because now I'm really interested in some of the other things you're doing too. But we are going to talk today a bit about some of the COVID research too towards the end of the show. But why don't we just dive into this mythology? What exactly is the myth of the model minority?
So the basic stereotype that most Americans would reference would be this assumption or expectation, as you said, that Asians are they're obedient, they're smart at basically math or science. They don't cause trouble, they're very quiet. And some of the things that maybe you don't necessarily think of, but sort of get attached onto this stereotype is that they're not very creative. They aren't good leaders because they don't speak up. They aren't aggressive. They aren't womanizers. These are good, in some ways, good and bad things, right? But a lot of these stereotypes are also gendered and sexualized, right? So what's interesting about the myth of the model minority is that people generally don't think about it beyond race, but the application of the myth is experienced differently by Asian American women, Asian American men, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, right? Some people who would be labeled as Asian in the census wouldn't actually fit the stereotype of what we think of when we think of Asian, which tends to be East Asian stereotypes, right? And so that means that maybe they actually more identify, for example, there's a colleague, Anthony Ocampo, who writes about Filipinos and their ties or their experiences and similarities to the Latinx community. And maybe most of them may not actually, identify as being East Asian in the ways that I would, for example, or other sort of Chinese, Japanese, Koreans might. And similarly, coming from Hawaii, we know that I did some research as well there where we know that Filipinos there, right, they experience very similar things that Latinos or Latinx population experiences here in terms of being overrepresented in the blue collar jobs, in terms of discrimination, sort of ethnic jokes and things like that. So we know that there's a lot of diversity even within, when we talk about the model minority stereotype, it's not actually experienced the same way for all Asians.
Yeah, wow. So what, clearly this is a problem, right? So what are the effects for these populations? Because I mean, I think that the other challenge and a lot of the data, certainly that I collect for the association, we just kind of have Asian, and we know that there's numerous ethnicities within that category, and there's so much diversity, to your point, where folks within the community are experiencing life very, very differently. So what are some of the effects of this kind of model minority mythology?
Yeah, so I think to even frame this conversation, we should remember that, like, so to start, right, race, where does race come from? Race comes, it's a concept that's been used to exert power over groups of people, right? It was made to hold dominance over other groups. And so when we think about how labels for races came about, when we think of like the census and the ways that these categories have changed, right? It's still, it's socially constructed, right? And so to the extent that you say that someone is Asian, there's always, in terms of the census at least, like different groups or ethnicities or religions or whatever being incorporated or not incorporated, or seen as a race versus an ethnicity, if you think about like the Latinx population. And so even within like a racial group like Asian American, which really is actually like a relatively new label, right? That came out of a lot of activism in order for this group to advocate for themselves, right? Means that not even the more recent, I would say, additions to this group or recent populations that have grown recently, like may not see themselves even in that, may not see themselves as represented or recognized when that category is applied. So when you talk about what the effects of this model minority myth is for this group, it ranges from everything, right? So from everything to, like I said, within the group, you can have, there's one way to see it, which is like, there's an advantage, right? Where the sense of like, well, it's good that if I'm gonna be stereotyped, at least I'm stereotyped as someone who like doesn't cause trouble, isn't reliant on social welfare, and like, is smart, right? There's worse things I could be stereotyped for. But there does create certain inequalities then, right, that happen where, for example, if you are, we can talk about research, I think I mentioned this before, about like disabilities, right? For example, where if you're a student and let's say you're an African or you're a Black student or a Latinx student, maybe you're being tracked into lower achieving class, right? So you sort of don't get the same high level training into like math, for example, because they expect you to not perform well. Well, maybe you're an Asian student whose parents, right, are working class immigrants who don't speak English very well. They don't know the US education system. They have you and all your brothers and sisters, right? And essentially you're being put into this high level math class because they think you're some smart Chinese student with rich parents, right? But you're not. And so what ends up happening is you can imagine the sort of stress, trauma, inability to belong in those resources, the constant failing of those expectations, right? And in some ways, I mean, maybe it's good. Maybe you rise to the occasion and you do really well, and it does happen, right? Because you have access to the resources. But in other situations, I mean, it can be really bad, right? In the sense of like, what's wrong with this person, right? That they aren't inherently smart, right? Falling through the cracks. And so and the same idea applies in terms of social support resources. So when we think about, like, I've done a lot of work with in terms of like domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and what ends up happening is that you don't, while you see you see resources for example, refugees, certain Asian groups, right? Specifically with like ESL types of groups, but you may not see the same sort of outreach or support for someone who would appear as like the model minority woman, right? Or you sort of expect, there may not be outreach, there may not be, even within the communities, support for outreach for mental health resources. And then when you think about the sorts of resources that are available, even now, like I've done work with fatherhood programs where they do provide these interventions, for example, for at-risk Latinx and Black men, but there really is nothing for Asian American men, or right, there's no outreach, there's no, it's like they don't even exist, right? Or this isn't a problem for them. And so I think what's interesting is that this stereotype really makes this sort of assumption that Asian Americans don't have problems, they're doing well. Why should we do outreach to help them, right? And I think that's a huge problem because they're humans and they do have, disabilities. They do have these varied histories because of immigration history and racism. Even, I mean, relatively recent, right? And I mean, before 1965, there wasn't a model minority. There was the yellow peril. So you can imagine that even within a few generations, like my grandparents would totally be teaching me how to overcome racism in a way that like I'm experiencing racism very differently, right? Where when I do, I was on a board for the Austin's Asian American Advisory Board for the City Council, and you can see even the people who are on that board, right, being of a certain select class of people who have the time and the energy and the education to do this work, but also that when we would hear from some of the advocates of the older generation coming in to be heard at the hearings, their concern was not so much, oh, we don't get enough help. Their concern was, oh, we're doing so well, like we want to be represented better, right? And so even within like communities, you have an older guard of like, the model minority was a really important political initiative. Like it was really important that we be seen as, closer to white than to Black or Latinx, because that meant that we could get citizenship. That meant we could get rights. That meant we could get jobs and support our families, right? That meant we could even bring our families, right? Because in the past, immigration, you couldn't even bring women, right, or children or whatever. And so that was really useful for them. So then when you have this younger generation of my generation where we're like, it's really important that we create solidarities with other minority groups, right? That's like a different set of political goals, which is shaped by our, current history or where we are right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I mean, there's this sense of, hey, yeah, there are benefits to there. I can see that old guard saying there's benefits to this mythology without kind of over a generation or two thinking about how then it makes you invisible almost in communities in terms of the mythology becomes institutionalized in a way that oh well, those resources aren't needed for those folks. And I mean, even in thinking about the social uprising of this summer, I've heard before that it was, okay, so we are recognizing that there are issues around racism related to COVID-19 for Asians and Asian Americans. But in terms of the social unrest regarding race, it seems there's almost relative silence about the lived experience of Asian Americans in that respect.
I would just add, I think because I've been doing this research now on COVID-19, and I know we're going to talk about this, so maybe this is a part of that, but in general, I think what's interesting about the racialization of Asians in the US and in terms of like the history that's been written about them is that the reason why it's important to study Asian Americans, and we don't when we tend to think about race and race problems, is that you're creating a political silence that really continues racism in the way that it exists, which is that even for me, only recently in grad school, like my whole life, I'd been told, coming up in Hawaii, right, where Japanese Americans have this like long history and have dominance in ways that like Native Hawaiians experienced what Native Indians did in the US, or Filipinos experienced what Latinx populations did in the US. So Japanese Americans are very privileged in Hawaii. And so my whole life I've been told this story of privilege and honor and just amazing citizens that were wronged during internment, right? But there's this other side of the story that I didn't really hear until, for example, if you've seen George Takei's Broadway musical, it's really great, Allegiance. But like my brother and I went to see that and I was crying because essentially it reflected like a history book that I had read by Ichiro Azuma on the sort of battle even within the community to not necessarily to be represented as the model minority, right? And in the sense of that, or the good immigrants, Madeline Shu would say at UT Austin, because there was essentially a lot of protest, like within Japanese Americans, that they were being wronged when they were interned, right? That
Right.
they're good citizens and the U.S. is wronging them, and so they didn't want to go to internment camps peacefully, and so many of those people left, right, or were deported, or essentially. And so I think that story gets really well hidden by history books, because there is this political racial project that benefits when you can think of sort of immigration policies and where a lot of these industries are getting, you know, top talent for low prices in terms of H-1B visas and that sort of thing. There's this thing that is profitable not only for that, but also for a system of racism that pits minorities against each other, to say that Asian Americans are the minority that is both smart and educated and has made it, right, successfully in ways that other minorities haven't, and that they're not causing trouble, right? And I think that the point is that there's this history of activism that gets really invisibilized, of like how Asian Americans have been very active in protesting and allying themselves with other groups. And so even in the Stop Hate, API Hate Reporting Center project, there's a article I have on the founding of the center that's coming out in the Journal of Asian American Studies in October, which is basically talking about how even the reporting center's founding, which has gotten a lot of press in the news in terms of like collecting data on these reports of anti-Asian incidents due to COVID-19, is informed by this long history of political activism, both on the grassroots level and on the political level, particularly, I mean, on the coast, but, you know, ideally those histories exist in other places, we just haven't heard them, right? And so I think that's really important to like, that whole model minority aspect is like, you're not telling the whole story, right? And that's bad, because it also perpetuates a system that seems to say the system works, but it really doesn't, right?
Right. And it also, I mean, it is very, you know, it's very damaging, I think, to the relationships with other minoritized groups, right, and other folks with marginalized identities, because it just kind of, again, the system then kind of builds itself around this myth and saying, why aren't you like them? Right? Why aren't you like them? Not recognizing that their lived experience is still a marginalized experience in this country, right? And so it really does us all a disservice, and really how pervasive the mythology is. So, Kara, why don't you tell us a little bit about your research?
Which part? My dissertation or other?
Yes, your
I mean, which project?
research.
Sure. Okay, so so I've done interviews with Asian American men, so US born Asian American men in the Austin area who live and work there, and they're in professional occupations, so white collar occupations. Most of them have college degrees, if not graduate degrees, but also most of them come from our second generation. A few are third or fourth, but mostly second generation, where their parents are immigrants, right, coming from Asian countries. And although, and because it's in Texas, or it's in Austin in particular, those demographics of who the Asian Americans are reflect that. So I mostly have interviewed mostly Chinese or Chinese diaspora, like Taiwanese population, as well as some South Asians, some Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Filipino men as well. But all of them, but you could see how it tends to run more Chinese or South Asian because of class demographics. Right. And so, but yeah, so I'm doing interviews with them, and basically the whole point of that research is to get at, I wanted to get at some of those, what we talked about when we say there are these silences in the research and in the public discourse about Asian Americans that exist and have continued to exist for political reasons, for reasons to support this narrative of the way that race works in the US, right? And so I thought I should interview the people that we would assume by race and gender are, for minorities, have no problems, right? We should interview the professional Asian men, right, who earn more sort of on average, even though averages lie, as we know, because they're not disaggregated, but on average, right, are more educated and earn more than white men, which tend to be the standard, right? And so, and my question was like, how is this, like, I think a lot of the research has been, how do Asians raise such smart kids, right? How this tiger parenting thing, how do they do this, right? And the thing is, like, my research is like, well, not only like how do they do this, but are there like costs, right? Like, what is the cost of like trying to meet those expectations given your context, right? The specific context of Asian Americans in the US. Are there costs, right? Is life really as good as we would assume it is for this model minority, right? And of course, what I found out was that there's a reason for these silences, right? There's a very political reason, which is that the model minority stereotype is about education and income, but it's not about the other aspects of quality that people measure in terms of what makes a good life, right? So when we think about the research on like the quality of social relationships, like health, family, housing, right? When we measure income, or when we measure poverty in the US, we have this very dated measure of just income, right? Other countries measure poverty in terms of health poverty, housing poverty, relationship poverty, right? But we don't. And so in the US, Asian Americans have found this place of fitting in and citizenship and limited belonging in some ways, because they have fit the need for the US to just talk about profit, right? Capitalism, money. And so that's where they fit in. But the problem is that when you make that concession, when you try to make yourself fit into what that stereotype is, what gets lost is you're not getting access to resources, right? In terms of like family needs, caregiving, health issues, mental health issues, things like, and some of these things have turned out where when you talk about that immigration policy that selects for people who have enough resources to come, who are also educated enough to meet the requirements for what the US wants in terms of skilled workers, but also are like giving up entire lives and communities of support, right, to come to this new place across an ocean where they may like know nobody or have very little like access or knowledge of the place, right? And so you're talking about a select sample of people that are making up this population that really are like the overachievers of the overachievers, right? And so when you think about the kinds of families that these people have, they're going to put everything towards that achievement. So the story you tell about Asian Americans is that, oh, for these people who've made it because of class and education, and then they're experiencing downward mobility, right? These parents are experiencing downward mobility because their language and their degrees are not recognized the same way in the US as US degrees and language, cultural knowledge, right? In professional occupations, they're telling their children, you need to outwork racism. You need to be even more of a model minority, put your head down, work harder than everyone else. So even if, so because for them, it's like, their ability to just be human and talk and whatever is not being recognized as something that, as a person who is legible in like a professional occupational like cultural office, right? And so only what's recognized is how technically skilled are you, right? And so what ends up happening is you get these kids who spend their whole lives being, because of, in my article I'm talking about this theory called like restrictive there's a theory in sociology about from Leroux on concerted cultivation and natural development. And so essentially what I'm saying is, with the Asian American situation, it's not that they're being nurtured into the tiger parenting model, and they're also not just being left alone, but what you end up having is this incorporation of Asian Americans in immigrant, like for example, grocery stores or convenience stores or family restaurants, right? Where they don't have the money and the resources and the cultural capital to go out and play soccer and join art clubs and go to summer camp. Their parents are basically saying, you come home, you help at the restaurant, and then you do your schoolwork, and that's it. And like, that's it, right? And so you have these students who are not getting the same sort of like dating experiences, friendships, athletic activities, right? But they are sort of getting this like full on force on like, the only thing we do care about is education, even if we can't help you do it, right? And so what ends up happening is these adult men, I'm interviewing them, and it's like, when they finally have gotten the job that secures them the financial, success that their parents like want them to have, security, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be leadership, but it needs to be a certain income and job security. Then they're like, oh, well, now I want a life, right? Now I want to like date and like get married, or maybe not. Maybe I actually just don't want any responsibilities anymore because I'm gonna have to pay for my parents' healthcare, right? Because they're restaurateurs, or I'm gonna have to pay for my siblings' education, right? Or my cousins or whatever. And so it's essentially like it ends up being like this. You end up having these bachelors, right? These men who are like very well off, very well educated, but experiencing a lot of relationship problems, either like at work where they're not seen as like leaders. So even though they're highly skilled, they're not getting these leadership positions. Or you're seeing it in like friendships where their types of jobs are so demanding that they're not getting time to really like invest in friendships in a deep way, or they don't know how. Or in dating and marriage, right? We see inequalities there in terms of when we talk about sexualities, and Asian women doing very well in dating markets, but Asian men not doing so well. And it's a lot of this has to do with that racialization, that sexualization coming back all the way from history, where Asian men would come and not be able to bring wives, right? So seeing them as like asexual individuals, seeing them feminized in media, right, as like men who aren't sexual in any way, and basically like in these dating systems where maybe they grew up in households where you don't have that sort of cultural capital that you would get if you were like a white man or even a Black man or a Latin American man, right? Where that people are into sports, people are into music, people are talking about the cultural stuff that's going on. But in these households, their parents are immigrants. They didn't grow up in the US. They're not living lives where they can like go see movies or like talk about dating, right? Maybe it was like arranged marriages. So these men are going to situations where they actually have not dated because they weren't allowed to, and then or didn't have time to, and then they don't necessarily know how to do it, right? Or how to deal with emotions, or how to like and so what you end up seeing is like, yes, this story of success is about high incomes, high education, but the context in which they live, which may be like paying for a lot of family members, being the social security for their parents, living in high cost areas, or just like, again, the quality of relationships as adults.
Yeah.
There's a cost.
Sounds like a huge cost. A huge cost.
But the thing is, nobody wants to measure that, right? Because it doesn't suit the story, the political story that separates minorities and pits them against each other, right? It doesn't suit the story of this group has made it.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because, I mean, yes, we know that there's this very persistent mythology, but it doesn't seem like, soon as you start scratching that, you realize that certainly it's a myth, but even the pursuit of trying to embody the myth is so costly. Wow. So to tie this to vet med, what might be some of the implications for this mythology? I think that we know that Asian American students are, of all populations, are underrepresented in vet med. And it is one of the fastest growing populations in the profession. But, I just know that there's whiffs of this mythology and kind of expectation, like, okay, well, the population is growing, they're going to be fine. Right. And even when we talk about support systems for, BIPOC students, as Black, Indigenous people of color, and people of color for our listeners and viewers, yeah, we know that POC is a catch-all, but a lot of folks don't even necessarily think about Asian Americans being a part of that population. So, for a profession that is struggling with diversity in general, what are some of the implications of this mythology?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that I can think of. In terms of I specifically study work and occupations. And so one thing that I would assume is also true, because this is also a professional occupation that comes from the sciences, would be that at least on one level, I guess, so on one level, and you could speak to this and push back on it and whatnot. What I see with the men that I've interviewed is that there's, for professional occupations, maybe if you're a veterinarian and you just want to get the job and sort of stay there and not take in sort of any leadership or sort of higher level types of positions, that might be, it may not come up. But for people who are in professional occupations and are sort of striving for any sort of authority or leadership type position where they're changing the field or, trying to shape public discourse for their profession, there's a lot of barriers that occur, which maybe if that's something you want and you don't have a person who can advocate for you, who can mentor you, who can show you how to overcome things or support you, or who doesn't really see you as someone who would strive in that way, who would want something like that, then you really do get invisibilized. And so I think it's, at least in other occupations, what I see is that some of these, and this is not only men, right? I think a lot of these things also translate for women, but they may look different because of gender and sexuality, or gender and sexism rather, is that this idea that, oh, you don't speak up, so we're not gonna promote you to this position, or we don't think you will speak up, or you're not leading in the correct way, or you're not, as funny as this guy, or you're not as like easygoing as this person, or you don't understand these jokes, or we're not going to invite you to this dinner party or this beer with the guys or something. And so I think what ends up happening is that in professional occupations where trust is built, which tends to like lead to, opportunities, Asian Americans tend to really get left behind. And so, and I mean, there's ways that, I think these men and women are very smart. Like they see that, so they find ways. And I think there's been studies of Black professionals who do the same thing, right? This idea that you whiten yourself, or you sort of make yourself fit into the expectation, right? So maybe for Asians, it's like, I decided not to bring my like smelly food to work because that will stink up the office, or I decide to only talk about the exciting, the like exotic or fun thing. So the sushi of boba is easy, right? Boba in Asia, but not the cultural, not the political unrest that is like happening in Asia, right? Like there are some things that are palatable about your identity that can be mainstreamed, right? For a white culture, for a white office, that's like, oh, that's fun. Like you have a, cultural dress for like this event, but like, right, that's like fun. But there's no aspect of like, oh, there's a history of colonization, that this dress actually appeared in your culture because we came and like took all your resources or something. And so I think there's that aspect of like only showing up in certain ways, right? That will allow a white culture to say that they're diverse and that you're there, physically there, but that you represent something, but you're not actually allowed to really change the culture in the office or be seen in a full way, right? Because you're not given that voice, right? You're just supposed to sort of represent diversity, but not change anything of any sort of organizational process.
Yeah, I mean, we see very, very few Asians in positions of leadership. We don't have, there are very few kind of at that associate dean level. There's none, at least in the US currently, I think, at the deanship level. And even in organized veterinary medicine, we're not seeing, we know that there are a few here and there, but we're not really seeing folks ascend to the very visible leadership positions. And and this issue of the food, and okay, well, we don't folks might not bring their lunch, but oh boy, like, ooh, what are you bringing to the international dinner, right? And, or like, are you going to dress up in your native clothing? And Tim Wise talks about that being the food festival and fabrics kind of approach to diversity, and how superficial it is, because it really kind of puts folks in a box, and it's like, okay, well, you can come out, here's your month, here's that Heritage Month, and we're going to do some stuff, and we're going to have sushi, and there's that, and then we're going to have a dress up day, and and it's very superficial versus getting into some of those tough questions, and really even understanding the diversity within this population. So we do have a question from a watcher right now, a viewer. Dr. Susan Williams wants to know how many of your subjects are now wanting to leave their respective professions that their parents may have pushed them towards.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what's interesting is that, I think that's what's so interesting, right? Is that when I talk to the white men, they have these varied job histories where they were allowed to like do all kinds of things when they were growing up, explore all kinds of things, have these very like varied ways to their positions. And even when they get there, it's kind of like by luck, right? Is how they see it, that they got promoted or that they get along with their boss or that, and with these men, it's like they're not happy, but they don't, it's not a problem. It's like they don't see it as a problem in the way that like these white men would be like, it didn't work out for me, so I just did something else because no problem, right? It's like that's just what you do. But with these men, it's like they've been raised in households where jobs were never like a thing that you did out of like passion, right? Jobs were like the thing that that allowed you to, one, come to the country, two, kept you fed, right? Like that, it was essentially like there was no sense of like, oh, you can like take financial risks and like leave this, no matter how badly you were treated, right? It was like, no, like like just like other minorities, like the job was not about like fulfilling yourself. It was like and particularly for Asians, it was like, this is the only way that you're able to access any sense of like being treated well, right? That you have a job and you're Asian. That's like the one thing, right? It's not because you play sports, or it's not because you are super sexual and like attractive. It's because, unless you're a woman, right? But essentially like it's because you have a job. And so I think with these men, it's like, even if they aren't fulfilled by their jobs, they see that they have at least reached the one goal that they were told to do from the very beginning in all ways possible, which is job security and income, right? That's like the one thing their parents who have wanted for them their whole lives, that their family depends on. And so if they do have things that they never got to do, which would be like sports, traveling, creative, artistic things, right? Now it's like, how do I do that with the time with the limited time that I have for my occupation? And that means for a lot of them, it's like putting off family, right? It's like, I can't have children yet because I want to like fulfill my childhood, desires. And that takes time and that takes money. And like, if I have kids, I can't do any of those things, right? And not only that, but I'm going to have ailing parents who, one, need my help translating, two, probably want to go back to Asia often, right? Three, maybe I need to build them a house, right? Like there's a lot of things that end up happening because of the social context that people don't usually think about when they think about Asian Americans, that mean that these men are not, I mean, one of the more disparities that you can talk about when you talk about representation, creative arts, multimedia, right? These industries where Asians are not getting a lot of, right, are sort of only now being recognized in any way and have very low representation, right? Part of it is that they've been told their whole lives to go into these stereotypical professions that are supposed to provide citizenship, provide job security, right? And really it's not any sense of like, oh, you should leave if it doesn't work out, right? It's more, no, this is what you're supposed to do, right? And there's no real history, there's no support from your networks to say, yes, go follow your dream, right? It's really like, the dream is that you've reached the dream, which is to have a high paying job. And the family is, and
all of the responsibilities that come with that.
Right. And what's interesting is that then you have some parents who will be like, oh, well, where are my grandchildren? It's like, okay, so you just went from telling me my whole life I'm supposed to like get this super crazy job, and now I'm suddenly supposed to just pop out kids without ever having like, figured out how to have a family. Like, because when you think about their parents, they're working two jobs that are not very enjoyable, that all the time, right? A lot of these kids never saw their dads, right? Never spoke to them because there were language and cultural gaps. And you're like, I want to be a father in this progressive idea of like emotional, like support and like help and like, but you've never really experienced that with your own father. How are you going to do that, right? And there's no sense of that community, that support, that you even need that, right? It just naturally happens. Parenting just like happens, right? It's not true.
Wow, I mean, it just ends up being kind of this trap that kind of replicates in some ways, it sounds like. So, you got these parents that are just working so hard, and their jobs are not dream jobs. Their jobs are functional, right?
Yes.
Jobs are means to an end.
Yeah.
Versus, and the end is financial stability,
yeah.
right? And the ability to provide for your parents, who, of course, everybody's, all the groups have the parents that are like, so where are the grandkids, right? Like, they're like tapping their watch. Yeah. but yeah, if you didn't have practice in dating because you were so focused, you know, and I mean, I think that certainly there are certainly other kind of parallel experiences, certainly like with African American women, like, you know, we're going
Yes.
those masters, we're getting the PhDs, we're getting the professional degrees, and then, you know, we are trying to date, but then we look around and we're like, oh, okay, well, it's just us, right? So we're just kind of hanging out, going to brunch. Right?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
yeah, this is it's wild. Wow. So one follow-up question: does the myth become less as there are more U.S. born generations?
That is also a really great question. And so I think what's really interesting is to watch how the population is changing. So even now, there's still a majority of Asians born outside of the US in terms of the Asian population in the US. But like this person has just
Sure.
said, that population is changing to now those generations are having children, right? Like me, like I'm a third and fourth generation from my family. And so as that population grows, right, you see these changing, the changing goals, sort of political goals of like the group, right, where you're seeing, like for example, even activism around like Black Lives Matter, more solidarities, the unearthing of histories that otherwise have been invisible, right, to give people the means to understand their histories in the U.S. as well as their ties to like other minority groups, and to see and to build up political structures and representation and ways for like things like the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center to become quickly a reality, right? Would not have been possible like pre 9/11, right? Because there was no call for like, oh my gosh, we really need these resources when these human rights violations happen. And so I think that's very true. Like I think the myth over generations, like when you see, well, I would take a step back and say, when in immigration research, we know, and a lot of this has come out of Latinx research, where you see the first generation being like experiencing that downward mobility, basically select people, right, coming are healthy, are have the resources to move, keeping their heads down, working really hard, sacrificing for their children. Then you see the second generation experience high social mobility, right, on average, where they're basically having this pressure to like make it, right, since their parents like gave them this sort of immigrant debt. And so they tend to do better than sort of the average population of their peers. And then in the third generation and probably downwards, right, you see sort of again that like averaging out to like what the average US population would look like in terms of like degrees and education and achievements, right? And you see that happening maybe by the third or fourth generation. And I think what's also interesting to note is that we know from immigration research, again, health research, that when, and I'm not sure if this is over multiple generations, but we know that when immigrants come to the US, their health gets worse, right? So we know that the stress of immigration causes stress on these families. And so the same thing, you can imagine stressed parents, right, with children, right, experiencing and so even when we talk about like future families and whatnot, I wanted to make this point to what I had said before, which is that even if maybe these men talk about, oh, of course I'm going to have children, they because it's like accepted, right, in terms of like
Right.
you know, if you have children, you're like a good father, a man, right? It's about a social role. They wait too long, because what ends up happening is that they themselves maybe did not have ideal childhoods, right? What they saw on TV was not what they experienced at home. And so this idea of like, do I want to have children, and the amount of work that my parents said having children was, and the amount of stress it was, do I really want that for my whole life? My whole life I've been stressed out about school. Maybe what would be best is to just kind of be a bachelor until, and you know, and by the time they're 40, you know, some maybe around 40, and they're like, oh, it's kind of too late to have kids because I'm not going to have the energy to play with them. Plus I'm working this like, you know, this really great job, and I want to be a CEO, and I have to work harder than everyone else, because when they evaluate my resume to everyone else's, they don't look at how I'm more qualified, right? They just look at the fact that I'm Asian. So I think it sets up a lot of these weird sort of not weird, but almost like sets up a context where you're seeing these costs and benefits that if you only look at one side, which is just the success side, like what is success in the US, you don't see the way that the costs are affecting, right,
Yeah, sure.
the decisions, I suppose.
Wow. So before we talk about a bit about COVID, I want to ask, what can we all do as a society to kind of help stamp this out? Like, how do we try to break this mythology?
Yeah. So, well, I think that, well,
No,
so this
small
is,
question, Kara.
I
Small
know, I know, I know. It's just the thing. The reason I sigh is because it is so frustrating, because just like all of the other systems where you're like, we know sexism is bad. Why does it still exist? We know gender inequality exists. Why does it still exist? Right? Like the same thing with this. It's like, we know that the model minority is a myth. We know that it's a stereotype. Why does it still exist? Right? And there are reasons, and the reasons, and like we had just said, is that there are political reasons that profit people, right? That profit a system in certain ways that create inequities and justify them, right? And so I think, how do you stamp it out? I really believe that there are two things that can really make a difference, and one is in the realm of well, because I'm a social science researcher, there are these pushes to disaggregate data. When we see like in the census, like these forums of like costs and benefits of the kind of, so when I was on that advisory board for the City of Austin's Asian American Advisory Board, and we did the first survey of the Asian American population here, the reason that we saw such huge health disparities that would not be captured in a national survey is that we put in all of our resources into translating the survey into five of the top spoken languages in the area, doing extensive outreach to, religious organizations, markets, restaurants, community centers, right? Essentially, it was like, we want to reach these populations, and we want to reach them with translators and people that will allow them to be seen and heard, right? And so the thing is, like, you don't usually have that investment in the normal data, the big sort of, how do we examine inequality, right? We don't even see Asians often as like it's just an other group. And so the thing is, like, and so on one level, how do you work on stamping out this mythology? It's making people seen, right? Making people seen as humans, not just as like, we only show up in employment and income, right, as the highest earners, right? We have to show up in all of the research, like in social services and health, in domestic violence, and in child abuse, and all of those things we need to show up. Disabilities, right? We need to do a better job of documenting these things, not just assuming that Asians don't have disabilities. And so on one level, it's being seen. And I think the more important reason of why do people need to be seen, why do these differences matter, is that it humanizes them, right? Yeah. It means that you go beyond the stereotype to see how they are just like every other person from every other racial group, right? The story that we've created the myth around is a story born out of immigration policies, right? It's not born out of like, because when you look at, for example, when we talked about activism, or if we talk about activism, like, Asians are extremely activist in other Asian countries. Think about Hong Kong or whatever, Taiwan. Like, but so you can't just assume that Asians somehow came to the U.S. and suddenly there was no activism gene, right? It's that you've selected certain people, or you're silencing them, right? You're just not hearing them. So that's one level, and then the other level is this aspect of solidarity, which is actually the same sort of goal, in the sense that the more that you're able to show, particularly through history, the ways that race has been used as a tool to separate groups, to pit them against each other, to oppress them, right? To justify the way people are treated unjustly. That sort of education, that sort of awareness, that sort of seeking of how to build commonality across race, across the divisions of race, and across intersections of race. For example, that you can see like white working class people being oppressed by similar systems that immigrants, right, or sexual minorities are oppressed by. And it's like, you need to draw those solidarities with other oppressed groups in order to really fight effectively the kinds of things that are being done, right, by powerful people who have more resources and more time. And so I think when you say to stamp out the mythology, it really means a sense of, what are the things that we can do, not only to believe that it's a myth, but to show how to be able to show that these group of people are humans and are not necessarily even a group more than anyone else is a group, right? And I think that's the hard work, is that so much of race and racism is about visuals, right? It's about physical representations and biological assumptions that people are different. When we know that when we actually look at a lot of this critical science and biological research, a lot of those differences are pretty much infinitesimal, like in terms of like there are more commonalities than differences, right?
Yeah. So we do have one more question from the chat. How does the model minority myth affect mental health? And this is from a pre-vet student who I know personally. He is Asian. He says, because immigrant parents believe in ghosts, but not mental illness. LOL. So
yeah. Oh yeah. Superstitions. Yep. But not, yeah. There are certain, yeah, exactly. Oh, I hear you. Oh, mental health is probably the one area of research on Asian Americans that I would say actually gets some funding, gets some space in psychological discourse research at least. And I think, and basically all it's saying to that extent is that there is a great need for mental health resources, and there is a great lack of success in that area, both in funding and outreach, and I think it's something that I feel like is growing and is needed and needs visibility. But I think the truth is just as you basically said, is that it's a lot of it has to do with education and outreach. That for a population who's like I said, most of the population is born outside of the U.S., where they're bringing not only a context of what health is there, but they're bringing it to a place where health is measured and thought about and very differently. And not only that, but the kinds of needs that these parents might have, like the kinds of issues that they're having in terms of getting used to a US population, or a cultural expectation, or racism, like these providers who may not be equipped for. Like, I'm part of this network in Austin that is constantly asking for, like, we need a translator, a psychiatrist, a psychologist who is versed in this, who works with this population, who can, because essentially not only is there not resources, people aren't equipped to handle these sorts of things because they don't, right? They're not trained. They're not, they don't know what the issues are. They don't know how to help. They don't have the language ability. And so I think what ends up happening is that it's a situation where, one, the problems aren't recognized, like in families and homes, among friends and communities. It's stigmatized. And then on the other hand, there's no outreach, there's no resources, there's no education or normalizing of, like, if other people can get mental health support, why can't Asians get mental health support? Like, there's no sense of, like, that's a weird thing, right? And it comes from that, again, coming back to that stereotype. Asians are fine. If they earn money, they must be doing well. They don't need help with anything else, right? And we know that's not true because there are costs, right? Like I just talked about. And so I think that's a great question, is like, how do you fix this thing that's been going on? And it's really like, again, I think what we said, breaking down that myth that Asians are doing fine and don't need help, right?
Yeah.
They're not humans.
So I want to take this moment, though, to say to our member institutions with well-being programs, check on your Asian students. Don't assume that their silence means that they're okay. So I think that that's one way that in academic veterinary medicine, we can be really intentional about doing that outreach, checking in on those students as well as those faculty who are just kind of conditioned not to talk about it, not to complain about it, because they've reached this level, and this level is equal to its success. And so this is just what it looks like, what it feels like. It's crappy. Okay, move on, right? And so, so to our colleagues in the colleges, check on your Asian students, faculty, and staff. So let's switch gears in our last few minutes a bit to talk about racism against Asian and Asian American in the time of COVID. So as you know, Kara, I did a show on this a few months ago, really early in the pandemic, but clearly language continues to be used at the highest levels of our government. As well as, at the local levels, so let's talk about that impact. I mean, for those of us that work in and around diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces, we kind of know the impact. But for folks that are not kind of, in those spaces, in those kinds of conversations, what's the impact of this very specific kind of racism?
Yeah, so well, I'm sure as everyone knows, the fact that anytime a person who has power, leadership, authority is setting a standard, normalizing any sort of behavior, there are trickle down effects, right? And so um, I've worked with the AAPI Stop Hate Reporting Center with Dr. Russell Jung and his community organizer partners, and we've seen from starting with news coverage and then moving on to actual reports that when, for example, the president uses, rhetoric like Kung flu, Chinese virus, China virus, Wuhan virus, it enable like these incidents, these racist anti-Asian incidents rise, the reports
Right.
rise, and so there's that. And again, even there's so much to be unpacked there, because there's differences like women, for example, women and elderly having maybe being more vulnerable, getting more, reporting more, experiencing more of these racist incidents because maybe there were people who were already, being already vulnerable and then now doubly sort of being seen as targets and people who won't fight back to that sort of treatment. It could also be underreporting, right? Again, this idea of Asian men trying to reach a certain masculinity, not wanting to seem weak by saying that they're experiencing these kinds of racist incidents. We see, of course, downturns in business. So talking about those small businesses that keep a lot of the Asian American population going, like these things that cause family trauma, cause stress in these families, basically taking hard hits, right? Closing down restaurants, businesses, markets, not being able to turn a profit anymore. And then as well as the types of incidents, right? So when we had started the reporting center being like, well, we would love for this to be housed in the government, or we would love for, there to be some sort of real, enforcement or response to when these things happen. But in terms of the ability of our law to like protect people for hate crimes, just like sexual violence, these legal tools are really inept or unable to even, there's no legacy or precedence of prosecuting at a rate that makes it worth it, right? For anyone to really even go through the process of trying to report something, unless it's truly reaches the level of a hate crime, which would be like, like evidence of physical assault and the kind of trauma you then have to go to prove that, and like what happens to your family and all of that stuff. And so even though there are these incidents, the vast majority ends up being more of like verbal harassment, people, spray painting things on property, or vandalism, or shouting something at someone as they run by, right? And so this idea that, or at a supermarket, right? Just like, so people, and so I think what we see is even during a lockdown where no one is supposed to be interacting with each other, people still want to, put themselves at risk by like telling, terrible things to people, like face to, and it's just like, so I think there's, obvious impacts where I know in my community, people are like, I don't want to go out. Like I'm scared, like woman, right? Being like, I don't want to go shopping. I'm going to pay extra money to have things delivered, or my husband is going to go, and then that's for people who can like afford these kinds of things. But there are some people who don't have that option. They have to go to the convenience store. They have to, they're already vulnerable, right? And they don't have an option, but they have to be exposed. And so even I was thinking about, there was a report of a Muni driver in California who in July, who like got beat, like he was driving the bus and 3 guys got on and weren't wearing masks, and they were saying, you need to wear masks, and they beat him because they were like, you're Asian, you have COVID-19. It's like, so many levels to that. Like, so, but essentially, right, it's this problem of like, you can't even go about your daily job during the lockdown and not be afraid. You're afraid to wear masks, you're afraid not to wear masks, right? Yeah. And so I think, and I think the other side of it is an interesting sort of response, really giving Asian Americans this opportunity to, again, like remind ourselves about a history of racism that has always existed and is only now being revealed or flaring up because of COVID-19. So These political structures that we've built up over time, these organizations, these grassroots organizing, really have this opportunity to respond in a way that builds solidarity with other groups, because we know African American men, for example, can't wear masks, so they're racially profiled. Like there's so I think there's an opportunity here for people to really make themselves heard. And I know we see a lot of social media sort of like hashtags and I'm not a virus and things like that, but also like real outreach and organizing across communities, right? Within to remind ourselves like what can be useful about an Asian American political identity, right? I mean, there are costs to it, but there's also things that can be done in terms of like voting advocacy on the local level, changing laws, helping to support Black Lives Matter movements on policing issues. Because essentially, and when you talk about like defunding the police, it's really more like investing in community, right? And in resources that are not only going to help African Americans, right? They're actually like, we could really do with more social services and community centers and things, right? And so the fact that a lot of these centers have been defunded, social welfare has been defunded in the US for so long, like the fact that we're redistributing, that you can vote to like help to redistribute resources that will improve the community in terms of public resources isn't only going to float like one racial minority group's boat, right? It actually helps everybody.
Everyone.
So,
Yeah.
And so I think that's the opportunity this sort of pandemic and racial crisis also presents.
Yes. So, so we, I think that one of the biggest takeaways is that we all have to be one another's advocate, right? And we have to stand together and, really try to be good allies. I mean, I think that we're all in this together. So, wow. Yeah. Oh, wow, Kara, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I think we've covered so much ground today and I've learned so much. So tell us, when are you slated to defend? How much time you got?
Yeah, I'm in my last semester. I'm just working on a lot of, like I said, these projects. It's very exciting. And yeah, I'm so glad I was able to talk with you and your community. There were great questions. I really enjoyed this.
Great. Thank you so much. And I will definitely be keeping in touch and really looking forward to seeing more of your research. So thank you again.
Thank you.
For joining us. So this has been another episode of AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air. To my guest, Kara, thank you again for being on the show. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. We're on all of them. And like us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air. And with that, I will end today's show. Thanks for listening.